Hello, welcome to the Evolving Practice Podcast. I'm Dr. Bill Moss, and I'm with,
I am Dr. Sean Carey.
and we're excited because we have another guest on this episode. And today's guest is a special one, especially to me. This is Dr. Lauren Moss. She is a PhD in counseling. She's a counselor educator. She has her own counseling practice, specializing working with young adults and adolescents. And she's also my wife. So she has plenty of wisdom to share. And this show is all about healing and the healing journey. And we are excited to have you on as a guest tonight.
Yeah, it's so good to see
Thank
you,
you for
Lauren.
having me. I know this has been a special project for you and Sean, and I'm excited to be part of it tonight. And yeah, a lot of people say, "Oh, the other Dr. Moss," and people often joke that I'm the checkup from the neck up. I'm sure you all have talked on the podcast about chiropractic and all of that. So, obviously, one of the things I think that um, you and Bill and I had in common from the beginning of our relationship was our interest in well-being and wellness and evolving and growing as people, which is one of the things that I think has enriched our relationship and kept us together for nearly 18 years, married now, so almost 20 since I guess we
Yeah.
met and know each other. But yeah, so people often say I'm the checkup from the neck up, and he's more on the physical body. So what I imagine I'll bring to tonight's conversation is more about mental health, mental wellness, psychology. But I'll see where the conversation takes us. I'm open to whatever we want to explore.
Well, it's such a great thing for us to explore because it's something that we haven't dived into yet. And mental health is such an important topic. Like we've had an episode, some episodes like getting beyond your boxes, like the mental
Okay.
limitations and kind of frameworks, and then also one about the voices in our heads. But we
Mm,
haven't really both Bill and I, we have our framework as a spiritual guide and then as a chiropractor, but we don't
right.
understand the inner workings of the mind like you do with your education.
Mm,
So I'm really excited to get your insight on like
yeah.
what is going on in people's minds and how can they have their minds be a better place to be, especially in times of struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure everybody's seen those memes, right? Where it's something, how's it go? Right. Something like, you're gonna spend your whole life in your head, make it a pleasant place to be or something like
Yeah.
that, but easier said than done. And um, I should have listened to that episode before I came on. But there's a lot of research that's really become mainstream. It used to seem more far out or only for people who were maybe in the margins of my profession, as far as the mental health fields go, but really around this idea that the brain body connection and how your thoughts influence so much
Yeah.
of how your body functions and your overall wellness. And that's always been something that has really interested me and that has intrigued me. And so I guess I could kind of start a little bit from the beginning and the way sometimes I explain things to my students as a counselor educator who are just coming into the field, starting their graduate studies, wanting to become clinicians at some point in their professional development or a potential client. Because there's a lot of confusion in the mental health space. What is a therapist? Who do I
Yeah.
talk to? What's a shrink? What's a
Yeah.
psychiatrist versus a social worker versus
Mm.
a counselor? And I'll do my best to demystify that a little bit as we start the conversation, though there's no simple answer. To it, but I often will say that mental health is kind of a continuum, and if you think about it, like over on one side is the medical model, and that's
Mm.
where your psychiatrists are, right? Like those are the kind of doctors who can
Yeah.
prescribe medication. I'm not that kind of doctor. My PhD is in counselor education, and that's really on preparing future licensed professional counselors. And the entire profession of counseling was actually born out of this idea that, sure, people have challenges with their mental health along the way, but it's more of a wellness model. Like, it's meant to be more around what's right with you. How do we capitalize on that so that we see less of this pathology? Not to say we don't play nice in the sandbox with our friends who are psychiatrists. There's a time and place, absolutely, to refer to them and to get their help. And some psychiatrists do a lot of talk therapy, but counseling at its essence, at its core, what a lot of people, even in the profession, don't realize is that we're by nature inherently more on this other side, more of a wellness orientation. And of course, though, you have counselors who maybe lean more towards one side of that paradigm or the other. And then I would say your psychologists, licensed psychologists, are more on this side with psychiatrists. And then you have licensed clinical social workers who, social work in general is more of the social contextual aspect of that. So they're more the ones that kind of know what's going on in the community, different agencies to refer to, how to kind of partner in that sense. But some of them have gone on for more additional training so that they are also licensed, and depending on what state you're in, can work with insurances and all of those kinds of things. So it gets a little muddy, but that's the general is kind of, on one side you have more of that medical model and paradigm, and then on the other you have more of that wellness orientation. And just depending on your theoretical orientation, your history, your training, the models that you use, you could be kind of anywhere along that continuum. I often identify myself as being like far over on that wellness side, which makes sense. My office is situated in the center that Bill and I run together, which is, for just, if you're picturing a physical space, it's in the lower level of his chiropractic office. So of course, chiropractic being very wellness oriented, then you have the spiritual piece of this and the energy work piece of this. And so the mental health part kind of just fits in with that.
That's so cool. And from like in chiropractic, we often talk about the difference between salutogenesis and pathology, and how in the Western world we get so myopic in our view, and that we always think about things in terms of pathology. What's going wrong, as opposed to salutogenesis, which is what the study of what creates health. And I didn't realize that was happening in the mental health world too, but I love that. That's so cool.
Yes. Yeah. And my background was in K-12, in the academic space, the educational space. And so I was a special education teacher turned school counselor, turned counselor educator, and licensed professional counselor. And so that was even a leap for me. And I think, like, just my own personal background and upbringing was very wellness oriented and
Yeah.
towards more of that salutogenic model. But then, you enter the educational space, right? And it's very, with our children in the Western world, is very, in my experience, identifying what's wrong with them in the
Yeah.
K-12 setting and how can we fix it, and what are the interventions and the money and the programs and all of these things. And so oftentimes, as Dr. Bill indicated when he introduced me, I work with young adults mostly and adolescents. And so often when a parent reaches out because they would like to look into counseling for their child, they've been told time and time again, what's wrong with them. And someone, usually it's someone in the school setting, has said, oh, they need clinical help. You need to reach out to a professional, someone licensed, and this could be because they're having anxiety attacks, or because they've made a statement that they're a harm to themselves, or they've thought about suicide.
Yeah.
Or it could just be like lack of motivation. Like, I don't understand. Johnny's not doing his work. We're told that there's something wrong. And one of the things I love to start with is just, after they kind of explain why they've reached out, it's like, well, it sounds like a lot of people have told you what's wrong with your child. Good news, bad news. If you want to talk more about that, I may not be the person to work with because,
Yeah.
and then I kind of go on to explaining my model, and how I really use a strengths approach, and that it's not that we want to ignore the problem, why they're calling in the first place. We want to identify that. We want to know exactly what's going on. But then really we're going to put that on a shelf and we're going to focus on how to bolster what's right with the child, what they're good at, what their strengths are. And when we continue to do that and we find the different interventions and approaches that work, and then we back out, and then a couple weeks later we say, okay, how is that problem going? Like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
like that's
Mm.
actually really improved, or it's hardly even an issue anymore. Now we're
Yeah.
working on something else. And so, um, but I think, generally speaking, when we have that initial consultation or conversation, I can feel the stress and
Mm.
pressure from that parent, like, just melting away. Like, "Oh my gosh, this isn't gonna be another person just telling me what's awful
Yeah.
about my
Yeah.
child," right? Because
Yeah.
most parents, see their child as this miracle
Yeah.
and this absolute amazing human, and then it's like, man, am I doing something wrong as a parent? Is there something broken with my kid? Like, what can I do to change that?
Wow.
That's a really, demoralizing place to be as a parent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had the educational background, but I feel like what you're saying brings me back to like sitting in these meetings. Like I was a special educator, just I don't think I got into that on the podcast, high school emotional support teacher. And that, pe- um, scale of support you were describing from social worker to psychologist and everything in between, the school district I worked in had all those. And you could see the build of like disconnect and frustration that occurred the more people and the more changes of intervention that went on and the more people that diagnosed the quote problem and how that affected like everyone in that circle. So this is kind of cool for me to like even hear. We talk a lot about lots of things, but I'm like, this is great to interview to
Yeah.
understand like how this fits together because in your what the work that you do, um, you work with parents and kids. Like, how have you seen that influence like work together almost like an infinity loop, like you're working with this one person over here and how's that affecting that other person and so on. What's that been like to see, like how one thing
Well, I
affects
should
all the
name, another group of my friends, my professional friends, which is the marriage and family therapists, the MFTs.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's another one. And those folks, quite honestly, like if you really need like systems work, those are the people who can like
Mm,
really unpack a lot of that. And I would never claim to be an expert in that space. Um, that said, it is an absolute privilege and a joy of mine to work with both the child and the parent together because the truth
mm,
is, I mean, when I was in the schools, particularly, and I was mostly in the middle school setting. By middle school and certainly by high school, like kids have autonomy. They can notice if there's dysfunction going on in the home. And a lot of times if you just name what that dysfunction is and you're like, I'm with you, I see it. Unfortunately, you can't change mom and dad. They would have to change themselves. All you could do is be the healthiest version of yourself, and let's talk about how we can work through some of that. Um, they get it and they're able to like sometimes that's all they need to sort of get through. But obviously, if you're able, especially with young children, if you're able to work with that whole family system, that that can make all the difference.
mm,
Yeah.
But I'm really fortunate in my small clinical practice. Um, I tend to work with families, parents that are very dedicated, very committed, very
mm.
willing.
Yeah.
Um, so there's not a lot of resistance, right? Like, so they've reached out and they say, here's the problem, help me help my child. And so they're open to my feedback. And when I give them some different scripting or language to use or approaches to use, by and large, nobody's perfect, but they're gonna give it, a genuine try.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's hard, now even as a parent myself, there are things that I'm sure if I was outside of myself looking in, I would say, oh my gosh, if she would just do this or she would just do that,
Yeah.
things would be so much easier or better or more healthier, for the family and for the child. But it's hard when you're in it. And so, and of course, the older the child is, the longer a certain pattern has been going on, the harder that is to break. But also, once it is broken, sometimes you can see pretty immediate results, which is so rewarding.
Mm.
Oh. Dr. Lauren, do you have like a favorite age group to work with, or it sounds like you have such a big spectrum.
um,
11-year-old girls.
yeah, I'm giggling because okay, so time out. Favorite, if I had to really just say,
Yeah,
I would say probably like early 20s, to be
yeah,
honest. Um, it's such an exciting time in life. Like you're your own independent person,
yeah,
but it's still really like late in adolescence. I think like now in the States, the literature is defining adolescence until like 25 or something. Like we have this very extended,
Really?
period. And what I think young people can stay on their parents' health insurance until 26 or
yeah,
something, so it's very, um, extended. I myself did a victory lap of undergrad, right? Like I just wanted
yeah,
to stay a little bit
yeah.
longer.
That's how we met,
Um,
though. That was the r
it
that's
is, it is. I always
thank
say
God
the
for
best
the
thing is
victory
coming out of
lap.
that 5th year. Yeah. Um, but it's also a chance to, I think, an opportunity in the lifespan, to really introduce some healthy relational patterns.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That if you can do that, then, oh my gosh, is it gonna like save that young person heartache as they move
yeah,
into adulthood or a marriage or the workplace and those kinds of things. And I think especially now with like millennials and younger, they're like eating that up versus I think, my generation
yeah,
and older, it was still a lot of this kind of pathologizing mental health in general, so it's like, oh,
Yeah.
you need to see a counselor, there's something wrong with you. Where now I'll get young clients and they're like, I just want to be better at my
Yeah.
relationships. And I'm like, amazing.
amazing.
Let's talk about that. And wow, what a commitment for a young person in their early 20s to be paying out of pocket to be better at that.
Yeah,
Like, I'm like, that
Yeah.
is so cool. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, what was I doing at that age? I was like, wanting to buy an
yeah,
extra bottle of vodka, you know
yeah,
what I mean? Like, so I just really think that's a beautiful shift that we've seen, um, in general with this, generation kind of coming through. But Bill said 11-year-olds because they're for a period of time. Like I think one of the unique things in my clinical practice and my approach is I keep my caseload like very, very low. And it's not necessarily what I would teach my students to do. So it's kind of like do as I say, not as I do. Um, but it's almost like a concierge type of clinical practice where I truly like I invite my clients to reach out to me if they need something between session. Like I'm very
yeah,
available. I think I still have very professional and healthy boundaries. And I don't think like a fresh new clinician would necessarily know how to navigate that.
Yeah.
But it works for me and it works for my size practice and it works for my clients. And I think they get a lot of value out of that. Um,
But in addition,
and
you're a full-time professor and you do, well, I'm like clinical supervision for them. So, it's also a choice to let people know that you choose to keep that type. So you have some form of balance in your life, based on the
correct.
other ways you serve counselors and in
Yeah.
your programs.
yeah,
Thanks for kind of contextualizing that. The main reason that I even started practicing,
Mm,
or that I maintain my practice is the once I took my appointment at the university in the tenure track, full-time position, first I was like fresh out of the schools and,
Yeah.
this is what I'm doing. It didn't take more than maybe 3 years before I realized like I'm going to become completely obsolete if I don't start working clinically again. Like it's just, I'm going to
Yeah.
be so
Mm,
out of touch.
that's
And
good.
I really thought my practice was going to end up being all children,
Mm,
because that was mostly my experience prior to that. And, so I said, "Okay, I'm gonna, like, do this," and then that's when I started just by happenstance, seeing a few young adult clients, and I was like, "Wow, this is really my sweet spot." That said, recently, why Bill said 11-year-olds when you said, "What's your favorite
Yeah.
demographic?" So I keep my practice really small so I don't get burnt out and I can still offer this level of care, clinically and balancing it with everything else. And so I said, okay, like I'm not taking any more clients. Like I really felt that I had hit my threshold. I know myself pretty well and what that looks like and what that is. And I said, but I'm doing something really amazing right now with 11-year-old girls with anxiety. So if anybody calls and it's 11-year-old with anxiety, I won't say no. I want, like the next day
yeah,
I
you
get
got
this phone, it's like 11-year-old anxiety. But, yeah, I don't know, I've got this little, like, protocol down with them, following the model that I talked about. It's very strengths-based, it's
Yeah.
collaborative with the parents, and it really feels like within, 6 to 10 sessions, they've really got a handle on what's going on, and, it just feels really good. I mean, I always say to people when I start working with them, like, "Well, my ideal is to work myself out of a job." I don't want you to be,
Yeah.
like, hanging around for forever. I think a lot of times people get the misnomer,
mm.
Yeah.
"Oh, if you start seeing a therapist, you've, like, always gotta see a therapist,"
Hey,
right?
they say that in
Um
chiropractic. How about
Yeah.
it?
well,
Yeah.
and this is where I think it's been so cool, for Bill and I that there are so many similarities, right? Because
Yeah.
maybe I borrowed this from you, I'm sure I have. Where I'll say, "My goal is to kind of work myself out of the necessity of a job." I said, "But, now that I've explained a little bit more about this wellness paradigm and the point of it, like, unless you just stop having goals and you stop wanting to get better, you might find that it's good to have
Yeah.
a monthly check-in or an
Totally.
every 6-week
Yeah.
check-in just for wellness and for health." And,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of people do. That said, especially with the young ones, like schedules get busy, things get
Yeah.
busy,
Mhm.
sometimes that's not feasible or that
Yeah.
doesn't feel as good. So I meet my client where they are, whatever they feel like they need. We make that decision together, which I would say is another aspect of um, quality high quality mental health support and counseling, that really ultimately or ideally should be a collaborative
Yeah.
process and decision. So I'm asking questions to help you decide what kind of support you
Mm.
need. And of course, unless I think someone is a danger to themselves or someone else,
Yeah.
I'm going to honor that and support that. And so that's a huge, like to me, that's a big responsibility and a huge privilege and something that I need to use a lot of discernment around. And, that I feel really lucky that my practice really has been built around it just being a joy for me and a way that I'm able to serve and
Yeah.
not the way I necessarily pay my electric bill, because I can really see how that would be a slippery slope. If
Mm.
you're, and there are so many wonderful agencies and high volume practices out there, and I can see that if that's the model, how that would be tempting to be like, just rebook next week, just rebook
Yeah.
next week, just
Yeah.
rebook next week, where we're not, maybe necessarily slowing down and checking in around those goals and really making uh, informed decisions in the best interest of the client based on the bigger picture. But that's why there's different models because there's the right fit for everybody.
I love it. You just shared so much.
I
There's so many different directions we could go. But earlier, right before we started the podcast, we were kind of talking about values and boundaries and how that's a big thing. And when you were speaking about the like young women in their 20s or young people in their 20s, uh, when I was hearing you talk, I was like, oh yeah, that is that time where we're learning boundaries for the
Mhm.
maybe the first time in relationships. We're
Mhm.
learning about our values in a different way. Often that's that period where you're more at home for the first time, or maybe you're living by yourself and you haven't before.
Mhm.
Could you go into boundaries and values a little bit and how that relates to our mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it came up because you asked me a question, something like, what's been going on, in
Yeah,
your world or your
yeah.
practice. And it is funny how there seems to be these themes that come in,
Mm,
and it's like
yeah.
all of a sudden everybody is having this kind of theme come up, and then that kind of theme come up. And I often wonder, like, is that me? Am I projecting this?
Well,
Or like, is that really there?
what's hilarious about this is, like, I just redefined, you didn't know this, but, like, I just redefined and redid our core values for my company, like,
Mm,
this past Friday, and it's been, like, a big thing for me to get this, like, y like, people have values, whether you put you put a word to it or you
Yeah,
define it, you have them. You just haven't identified them and they're not part of the culture. And I'm like, I did all this work on core values in my company, but I was like, nobody knows them. That they can't,
yeah.
they could talk about our
yeah,
culture and describe it, but it's not simple enough to be like, these are the four core values. So it's like, that's actually what I spent last week at the end of the week refining. So it's interesting that you're like, this is a theme that's becoming important to other people. And here I am not having, we're not talking about this, but I've actually been doing that kind of work
Yeah.
because that's important as well. So that's
And
cool.
obviously I couldn't have led you to that because you're spontaneously telling us. So I guess it's just out there in the world right now.
yeah,
But values are a great, I call it like a great filtering mechanism. And I mentioned earlier about how I use a strengths approach. So I talk about it, that you could kind of layer them, right? So if you know your strengths and you know your values, we can kind of combine these as a way for like any decision, any action, anything that comes into
yeah,
your life. Once we hold that, the next thing is to kind of say, okay, how does this settle in around my strengths and my values? And then that will ultimately lead you to what you need to do about whatever's being presented. So a lot of times my job as the therapist, as a counselor, is just to kind of remind you of your strengths and your values and then say, okay, based on those strengths and values, what do you feel you ought to do about this job opportunity or relationship decision or challenge at work or whatever the case is? Um,
yeah,
and of course, boundaries being some like kind of a subsequent conversation around that, right? So now if I know my values and I know what I'm good at, I know my strengths, I know my magic, but I'm still having this rub, this nudge, this thing that keeps happening. Maybe there's a boundary that needs to be set,
Mm,
yeah,
with that person or that relationship or that role that you have.
mm.
And so that has definitely been coming up a lot in my clinical practice. And so then, of course, I do notice it in the world, around me
yeah,
too. But I think one of the things with, um, we talk about different directions, like there's so many things I can
yeah.
say about it. And there's lots of different quizzes you can take online. And, I know Bill and I have used a values sort card deck, which is
Oh,
really
yeah.
helpful.
Oh.
Um,
I was just gonna ask, like, how do you direct somebody who maybe doesn't know their values, like, to start figuring that piece out?
yeah. Well,
We,
you could definitely link it to that card deck, in the podcast or whatever. You could Google, values sort card deck. There's
yeah.
a bunch of them on the market.
Oh, wow.
There's also, like I said, different quizzes online that you can take. Um,
Yeah.
but your values is like what's important to you, right?
Yeah,
The funny thing is a lot of people would end up saying like, oh, family, or oh,
Mhm,
faith or whatever. And
mhm,
I often reflect on a mentor that Bill and I had a number of years ago in a Bible study, actually. And he used to say, um, if you show me a person's bank statement and their calendar, I can tell you what their values are.
mm,
And I remember that really hitting me personally because I could say, one thing was my values. You know, if you
Mhm.
said, what are your top 3 values? You know, I might have rattled off one thing, but then if you looked at my calendar and my bank account, you might not find that those things were
Yeah,
congruent.
Yeah, really
And
good.
that really stuck with me. And so I think that's a way to kind of audit your own
Mm,
values. Maybe if you're also like, I don't even know where to start. What are my values? Well, take a look at your calendar and take a look at your bank statement and then see where you're spending your time and money, these two very precious resources that we have. And that would tell you at least what one would assume
yeah,
your values are. And if
yeah,
that doesn't sit right with you, if you're spending hundreds of dollars a month on clothes and
yeah,
fashion or isn't
yeah,
your value, well, maybe you want to think about that, right?
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's funny you brought this up, and I forgot we did that activity like a month or so ago. In this values discovery, I was reading a book and they recommended these cards, and I was like, that sounds fun. I'm going to order them. So I ordered them, and then we did this, and we kind of broke it down from, this is like not at all, somewhat, very, and I learned from that process, like just to kind of
Mm,
share is like, um one of my values I never could really fully identify. And now I see how it permeates everything I do. And that's like simplicity. That's the one. And Lauren at first was like, I don't think you're simple. And it's
yeah,
like, I can't stand when things are complex and I can't find something and I'm not efficient and I don't have a simple system for it. And it's actually helped me see where something's been going on for years. So I could see as a counselor how important this would be for somebody, because it's not to say like how I was in my life was wrong or anything. It's like I couldn't even bring awareness to the fact that this was a value. And like once you have
right.
that, you're like, there is this level of freedom that you probably see with your clients where it's like, oh, thank God I understand that part of myself.
Yeah, and that's not, I mean, a lot of the therapeutic process is about um, finding language to explain what's going on
Mm,
inside, right? Like
yeah,
in my head.
yeah.
yeah,
How
yeah,
do I articulate that? How do I explain that to someone else? And first, I need to understand that myself. And so I think something like the values card, first of all, I love that it's like so tangible and like concrete.
Yeah.
That's just fun.
Yeah.
Um, but secondly, I love that it just gives you clear words,
yeah,
and really one of the best parts I think about it is then I talk with my clients about, well, what does that mean to you? Because
Yeah.
what that word means to one person might be different
yeah,
to someone else. And it doesn't really matter, if simplicity means one thing to Bill and means a different thing to me, as long
Yeah.
as he knows what it means and he knows how to explain that to someone else, like that's the important part. Because to me, I think like when he was saying that, I think of simple as being like basic, like not having a lot of depth. And he was like, no, 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 no. Like that's not what I
No.
mean by that. I mean,
yeah,
not having unnecessary complexity to it. Like I want
yeah,
to the point, and then that helped me. Oh, okay. Yeah, you do like to the point.
yeah, yeah,
So, yeah, I think, and then something that Bill and I have talked about, and I would love to take to the next level in our relationship and in our family, and we had a lot of fun with just dreaming about was like, okay, so now I've done mine and I've got my top several, and he's done his and
yeah,
his top several, and oh, cool, look, those two are the same, or that one was
Mhm.
also in my top 10, and what are our family values?
Yeah.
And so this is something that I'm working with two different clients actually right now in with one client it's two different cultures kind of coming together and starting their family, and what are our family values,
yeah,
because maybe we grew up with different um celebrations and holidays and different things. Well,
Mm,
what are the core values for our family, not just the family of origin? What are our
yeah.
things?
yeah,
And then with another client, this that she and her boyfriend are kind of trying to figure out, like, do we want to take this to the next level or not,
Mm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
is this
Mhm.
going in the direction of marriage and making a life together, or are there some differences here that we're not really going to be able to overcome? And so I just think it's an amazing tool to be able to use, and a really
Yeah.
fun one, and so important.
Yeah.
Really kind of using it even to make like a values statement for
Yeah.
the family. And I think if children, kind of bringing it back to that, when children can be part of that too, I mean, how incredible.
It's such a beautiful thing.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Do people sometimes have clashes? Like, so from a mental health perspective, is it when working with clients, do they have clashes between their values and their boundaries? Or is it that maybe they don't know their own values and then that creates some discord within them? Or like, where do people
Um,
get mixed up
I,
sometimes?
it, yeah, that's a great question. The way I would explain it, at least so far, and the way I'm experiencing it for myself and for others, is similar to your strengths, right? Like, so I'll back up to strengths. If
Mm.
I am really good at, like, I'll give an example. Responsibility is one of my top strengths. So I'm responsible. If I
Mm.
say I'm going to do something, I'm pretty much going to do it. I've actually
Yeah.
gotten to where I had to like be softer on myself because I was like stressing myself out
Yeah.
about that. But it is really hard for me to perspective take with someone else if they don't do what they say they're gonna do, because I'm like,
Yeah.
"But you said you were gonna do
Yeah.
it."
Yeah.
But that's because that is just such a fundamental strength of mine. I don't It's hard for me to understand how hard that can be for somebody else, right?
Yeah.
Bill has competition. That is one of his strengths. It is really hard for him to understand. It's like one of my bottom strengths. I truly do not care who wins the game. Like, I do not care.
Mm.
Well, you care a little bit, right? Like, I really don't. So it's really hard to
Will you root for
understand.
me? Will you
Yeah.
just root for me?
Yeah. And our daughter's the same way. And I'm just always the one like, what are we all
Is she
worth
super
about?
competitive or she doesn't care?
She's competitive. Oh, cool.
Oh, she wants to win.
She
She
Yeah.
wants
wants
to
to
win.
win.
And I'm like
Um,
I'm like, "Honey, I got this one. You need to just
Yeah.
keep your non-winning stuff over here because
yeah,
we're trying to bring winning into the
We're trying to produce
environment."
winners.
yeah. He'll be like, but I can eat more broccoli than you can. And all of a sudden she's eating all her broccoli. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what just happened? Like, did we just have broccoli competition? Like, that would never have worked on me when I was a kid, right? I would have been like, okay, like, we'll all just not eat
Yeah.
broccoli. I don't
I can clean up these
understand.
toys faster than you, Ava, and then it's like, it's on. I'll be like, "No, I
Where
don't
I'm
think
more
you
like, don't we want to all have a clean house? We should all
Yeah.
pitch in. And like, they're both like, nobody cares. So,
Oh, man.
um, so
That's so
that's the
cool.
strength thing. It's very
Yeah.
similar when we get into values, right? Like, what's important to me, it's just so fundamental, right? Like, you almost don't even realize it's a value because it's just,
Yeah.
doesn't everybody think this way? So it's really worth taking that time. And this is what I do with clients the first several sessions, is really drilling into what are your strengths? Like, what is that special magic that makes you you that you don't even realize is a strength, because you're so good at it that like you just think that must come easily to everybody, but it doesn't.
Mm,
Yeah.
And then what are your values? What's super important to you? What is the thing that you are going to like, that's going to be your hill to die on? Those are the things that then are really kind of going to drive you to ultimately like fulfill your life's purpose, right? So like
mm,
that's like,
Yeah.
way over there,
yeah,
but right now like let's figure out what that is. And so once you know those values, it's helpful to be able to communicate it to others because they are not that same way. And you need to stop projecting that onto other people,
Mm.
mm,
right? And
mm,
assuming that because it's important
yeah,
to me, it needs to be important to you.
Yeah.
And so here's the connection with the boundaries. Because it's important to me and I think it should be important to you, I start to put rules on what you ought to be doing and what you ought to be doing and how you ought
Yeah.
to live your life and how you ought to live your life. And I think that those rules are boundaries, but those rules are not boundaries. Those rules are just rules that I have created in my head that's actually rigidity.
Mm.
Because I'm saying you should do this because it's important to me and these are my core values. That's not the way it works, right? A boundary is something that you do. So, this isn't a thing in our relationship. This is like not Bill at all, right? Like he's very good at like doing what he says he's going to do. But let's say Bill is like
Oh,
chronically
I
late.
learned something
Yeah.
about myself. Thank you.
Yes, you are not like you like when you say you're going to do something, you do it. But let's say I have a husband who doesn't do that and he's late all the time. Me saying you can't be late anymore, you need to start showing up on time, you need to be think I'm
Yeah.
important, that is not a boundary, right? The
Mm.
boundary is in my relationships, it's really important to me for people to show up on time. If they don't, I do blank. There's the boundary. It's something I do.
Mm.
I love it.
Mm. That's really good.
So, this is where sometimes then relationships, this is how it helps us figure it out, right? Like, is this a relationship that I can be
Yeah.
in for the long term? Or are there fundamental differences in values that is going to make that really challenging?
Yeah. What you just said brings so much clarity. I was having a lot of light
Mhm.
bulbs go off when you were talking.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are like cornerstones that like we all can just rinse, lather, repeat, right? And like
Well,
Yeah.
continue to kind of get clarity around and live it out.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so like just hearing you talk about the work you do and the progress that you've made with individuals and also the reflection of like where people are is so relevant. Like you've said things about, oh my gosh, this generation wants to care for themselves. Yep, maybe they need new systems. Same thing. I remember when I started this practice and people are like hating, 12 years ago, hating on millennials. And I'm like, millennials are
Hmm.
amazing. They're like, I
Mm.
see how bad the world is and I want to do something different.
Yeah.
And then you see this desire, like you're saying, like, who cared about core values 30 years ago? Did they? I don't know. Maybe not. But people do really want to know themselves
Yes.
to a
Hmm.
much greater degree, whether that's healing work, physically, what they're capable of, mentally, like the ins and outs and inner workings. It's like, just having this conversation makes me see like how much more relevant the idea of like we want to know the depth of ourselves
Hmm.
for many different reasons, but it is what's occurring, and the way you kind of just drew the values and the boundaries to help people understand is like really important because obviously that's where the world's going. We're all seeing that. I think we've had a lot of episodes that are
Yeah.
around the topics that you're describing, and you're almost like
Hmm.
tying most of them together
Yeah.
today. It's really
Awesome.
cool.
Yeah. That
Cool.
piece about knowing thyself is so important. And for me, when I feel probably most mentally healthy, it's like I'm just very aligned in doing what my gifts are, and living within those within my values, and just like
Mhm.
owning my strengths, living within my values, and then I'm really happy when I do that.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to hear with this conversation.
Yeah. I was talking with a client a bit ago, and we were talking about boundaries, and they were saying about maybe that's important. I think I've like always been this people pleaser, but I'm not really sure. And I was like, well, tell me more about that. She's like, well, I just
Yeah.
want people to be happy. And I was like, all right. So how do you go about doing that? And she's like, well, if they say they want X, I do anything I can to make X happen. Right. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, how's that working out?
Yeah.
Like, well, sometimes I can't make X happen. And then I feel really bad about that. Whatever. I'm like, okay. And then we were kind of continuing to talk. And I'm like, when do you feel or she said, I'm sorry, she said, well, you know, there's just some people though that you feel really happy around, and I want to be one of those people. And I was like, well, what are those people like? And basically, like the conversation goes, that she's like, well, they're just joyful, like they're exuding
Yeah.
joy. Oh, so they're not doing cartwheels and contorting
Yeah.
themselves into uncomfortable positions and crossing their fingers that people around them are satisfied based on those gymnastics. It's
Yeah.
their own exuding of the joy that just brings everybody else up. Where we draw the boundary is, if you can't be here, enjoy with me, that is okay. You
Yeah.
have your own free will to be. And I ended up using this weird metaphor of
Yeah.
they were down at the bottom of the ocean and she's buoyant, right? Like
Yeah.
you're light and you're exuding this joy. At some point you need to let go of this thing that is trying to pull you down, but you can still say, hey, it's really great up here and you're welcome to come anytime.
Yeah.
i'm not I'm not withholding this from you,
Mm,
but I can't leverage myself
Yeah.
to make you happy.
mm,
That's not the way it works.
Yeah.
I can't for that it's forsaking yourself, right? And then you
mhm.
end up at the bottom of the ocean with that person. And so we keep the door open, we keep the invitation there, maybe, you know, as long as it's not like a super toxic, like gross relationship, you can keep that open. But the boundary is where it's saying, and I won't go there with you. I won't go down there. And that's hard. That can be really hard when you're talking about, that's a parent or that's a spouse or that's a
Yeah.
child, you know, your child. Like that can be really hard to say, I won't go there with you. And, you know, one could argue that like true empathy is going into those depths with that person when they're in that very sorrowful place. And you need to do that very intentionally and mindfully.
Yeah.
You know, you need to make sure that you actually are able to float back up to the surface,
Yeah.
you know, if you're going to reach down that far.
That's why I see a lot of really well-meaning and good-hearted practitioners just getting totally wiped out. Is
Yeah,
that they screw up that piece and they, you know,
totally.
they end up sinking to the bottom of the ocean. They don't realize how they're doing it,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
yeah, they can get really stuck and burdened in a way that can take some time to come out of.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like I'm talking with my client about this and their relationships with the same thing. There's definitely a parallel process, practitioner to client, right? And you can deal
Yeah.
with some really heavy cases. And if you feel like, well, my client's challenge or frustration or quote failure, you know, whatever you want to
Yeah.
think about that is mine. I should have done something different. I should have done something more. I should have,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that's not healthy or helpful for anybody. Uh,
So
Absolutely.
and
how have you
unfortunately, it's a lot of like very well-intended people who are attracted to the field. And so
Yeah.
I would say then that's my like more counselor educator side of it, is when someone comes in. And, you know, the admissions essay is all writing about how, well, I grew up in a family that had substance abuse issues, or, well, I grew up, you know, in extreme poverty, and awesome. And like, how amazing that now you've made it to graduate school and this is what you want to do.
Mhm.
And let's make sure that you're stable and healthy and that those
Yeah.
pieces of your history, you're not carrying that baggage into every session with clients, and that there's this, you know, transference or counter transference that then happens because you're not aware of where that's showing up.
Mhm. Mhm.
So well said.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with that
Know
being said,
thyself.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, I know some of the answers to this, but I just feel like this is relevant and important. And we're, you know, there's the aspect of like you're talking about reaching out and getting pulled down. And that's a very easy and real thing that happens to many practitioners. And I know for myself, like as soon as I started kind of walking the healing path that we, you know, Sean and I have talked about through the modern mystery school and things of that nature, I definitely took on less stuff of people right away. Saw a
Mhm.
huge difference. Like my energy was becoming separate. There was at least like a separation at the end. Talk a little bit about the importance of, your own practice and your ability to maintain it, because I feel like you really do work in that mental world. And when people get mental on me, Sean might feel the same. I'm just like, oh my God, I didn't choose to be like this counselor. And like, they're just, but it is part of every healthcare
Yeah.
practitioner's world, is to really listen and, be with people,
Absolutely.
right? We're never
Yeah.
getting away for that.
And before I even like get into that, I would say, and I think that's one of the major what's the word? Travesties
Mm,
of the medical establishment as it is
yeah,
today,
totally.
is that, what we might have called like bedside manner of
Mhm.
the physicians of yesteryear. Everybody I talk to,
Mm,
it feels is constantly telling me about how they've had and I don't mean to come down on, medical doctors by any means. I think they're experiencing a lot of this
yeah,
burnout,
Yeah.
compassion fatigue, overwork, having to work in a system that isn't set up for wellness and health and support.
Yeah.
And so I can absolutely see how easy it would be
yeah.
to fall into that. Oh, I've got to do my notes and I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And I'm exhausted and it's the end of the day and wake up the next day, rinse, lather, repeat. I'll
Mhm.
plug a book real quick that I recently read. And it's called When Breath Becomes Air.
Hmm.
Mm,
And now I need to remember who authored it. But it was a medical doctor who wrote it after, I just want to find out the author for you because he's amazing.
we're not famous enough yet to have somebody like looking this up while we have a podcast going on.
Yeah, right?
Goals.
Um,
Goals, yeah.
Paul T. I'm probably pronouncing that name wrong. Stanford University neurosurgeon who died from terminal lung cancer in his mid-30s.
Mm,
And so it is such a beautiful memoir. I won't give too much away, but basically he's like a poet and a medical doctor merged
Yeah.
into one and always kind of
Yeah.
cool.
struggled with this. Do I go more with my um, poet side or do I go with my more scientific side? And,
Mm,
so he ends up going to medical school and he's so gifted and he's doing that always with this thought that he's going to write a book. And then he gets diagnosed with this terminal cancer and he decides to write his book as he's dying and about his experience. And he talks a lot in this book. I think what really hit me on the topic we're talking about is this he just refused, even with the demands of his outrageous residency with Stanford and all these things, he just refused to sacrifice the level of patient care. And he talks about this
mm,
amazing privilege that it was as a neurosurgeon and how, like, what other field do you hold, like, someone's humanity, is
Yeah. Yeah.
their brain, and the function of that neurology. And so, when we're making choices about how much of your brain to remove and what might be some of the side effects, like we could say maybe in some areas of medicine, that level of bedside manner matters less.
Yeah.
But I would argue that when you're in any of these helping professions, um, who you are matters and you
mm,
need ways to protect who you are and
Yeah.
what those values are that drove you to that profession in the first place so that you can actually do what you've set out to do and not become part of this mechanistic beast that
Yeah.
sometimes I think a lot of people in the field feel is running the show.
well,
That's
Because
an incredible share.
it's sad. Yeah,
yeah,
it's sad.
yeah.
And I think and I would say the same thing about teachers, right? Like, I think a lot of our hospitals and our schools are filled with people who had the best intentions
100%.
and are currently, however,
Yeah.
so overwhelmed by the demands of the job and the field that, you know, they're just trying to play by the rules,
Mm,
and the rules are
yeah.
set up, but nobody's winning, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
the doctors are burning out, the teachers are burning out, the kids aren't learning anything, the patients are still sick, and we're all kind of here like, "What's going on?" And so, I
Yeah.
think for people who maybe are listening to this podcast and, are in whatever discipline, um, really thinking about how do I protect myself? How do I protect my energy so that I don't fall victim to that,
Mm,
Yeah.
that we've just kind of described. And I think that looks a little bit different for everybody. Um, for me personally, I for sure have things that I do to help me feel grounded
Yeah.
and calm and like I can hold that space for somebody else. Because if I like run into a session and I've just had a bad experience or a bad morning or a bad
Yeah.
day, and now I'm bringing that in, that's a problem. At the
mm,
same time, I also feel like it's really I use a healthy level, I think, and a professional level of personal self-disclosure to empathize with a client or to,
Yeah.
you know, remain human. Like I'm not there to be this like robot, and
mm,
so that's a balance. But
yeah.
knowing yourself, knowing your energy, like knowing how that works for you, and when you're in a state where you're best in service to others, to another person,
Yeah.
and able to see the divinity in that other person, like that, whatever helps you get there, like that's the most important thing. Um, and I think that's what he so beautifully articulated in When Breath Becomes Air. And that's what I strive toward to be more like. Do I hit it all the time? No, but um, we keep that as
Yeah. It's the
the
goal
goal.
to keep moving towards. I have like 15 other questions and things I'd like to share, but I think we're going to need to bring you in for another interview, Dr. Lauren. This was good, but it's been an hour, and yeah, we kind of reached our limit. Is there anything that you
Yeah.
want to wrap up with, or Dr. Bill, that you want to share before we?
No, I mean, this is really helpful. I live with this person and like
Yeah.
it's kind of cool to like just hear the expertise and from a different perspective. And we're both experts in our own areas and we actually don't get to kind of shine in a way of like, hey, like let me show you all I got and all our knowledge. So I'm like, this is such a cool episode. Like, I'm like really excited to share it. And it's funny, you talk about like this small niche practice, and I'm like, oh, I could share this to my clients. And like, you'd have so many clients because like just what people don't know is all the work you've done behind the scenes, and I've seen that over 20 years, and all those things accumulate to who you actually are, and they can't be discredited. And the culmination and the accumulation of all of that is what you bring to the table. And I think when you describe somebody who's progressing, like wants counseling services over time to remain well, they can't do that with somebody who's not continuing to do that for themselves over time. And I think you're kind of one of the epitomes of what that means. So thank you for being on our show. We're super grateful for you to be here. If you want to be contacted, what's the best way for somebody to get in touch with you? We're going to tag you on Instagram and all that fun stuff.
Oh my
But
goodness. Bill's always on me about like what website. I'm like, no one goes to that. I don't want to even have I don't no, I just use
that's
this like
good.
random
Direct.
Gmail. Probably like whatever like social media, just like inbox me if I'm tagged in that. That's
Yeah,
cool. I'll get back to someone.
cool.
Reach out to Bill, then he'll make sure you get in touch with me.
Now I just became your
Yeah,
assistant.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that's what
I
this
know,
episode.
and he was just saying the other day about how, like, he was reading about these celebrities who are getting rid of their smartphones, and he makes this comment like, "If I got rid of my smartphone, then everyone would just be reaching out to you." And I'm sure my face was like, Absolutely not.
Yeah.
So I'm flipping the script. Now it's back on you. If you need me, reach out to Bill.
Yeah.
He can
That
get
would
you.
violate,
He's
like,
my
15
virtual
boundaries.
assistant, Bill.
Well, yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for
Yeah.
being on. And
Thank
if
you
you,
so much.
if you love this, if you were listening and you've been with us, we've had a great start so far. Take a moment to, subscribe, rate, and review. It helps us move up, helps us reach more practitioners and people who are interested in exploring the healing world. So thanks again for being here, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.